There were gifts for everyone in that room. The neighbor who dropped off a plate of cookies got a gift bag with a bow on it. The mail carrier got a gift card tucked into an envelope with his name on it. Every grandchild, every in-law, every person who had walked through my mother's front door that Christmas got something wrapped and placed under her tree. I sat on the couch with a paper plate of food on my lap and watched it all happen. When my sister laughed and said, "Mom, did you forget Carol?" My mother waved her hand and said, "Carol understands. She doesn't need things like that." The room moved on. Someone turned up the music. I kept my face still. 2 weeks later, my phone lit up with a text from her. "Carol, I need you. Something's happened. You're the only one I can call." I stared at that message for a long time. And the question that sat in my chest was not whether I would go. I already knew I would go. The question was whether anything would ever be different. Whether I would keep showing up for a family that only seemed to notice me when they needed something. That question had been sitting in my chest for most of my life. This is the story of the year I finally answered it. My name is Carol Menson. I am 38 years old. I am the oldest of 3 children, a wife, a mother, and for most of my adult life, the person my family called when things fell apart. I am not someone who talks about herself easily. I was raised to handle things quietly, to not make a fuss, to be the one who kept going when everyone else needed a moment to fall apart. For a long time, I thought that was strength. I am only now beginning to understand the difference between strength and silence that has simply been expected of you for so long that you forgot you had a choice. I want to tell you this story, not because I want sympathy. I want to tell it because I suspect some of you have lived a version of it. And if you have, I want you to know that you are not alone and that something can shift, even when it shifts quietly. Section 1. The night it became real. The Christmas tree at my mother's house in Columbus, Ohio was the same every year. White lights, the same glass ornaments she had owned since before I was born, the angel on top that leaned slightly to the left, no matter how many times someone straightened it. The living room smelled like cinnamon and the particular warmth of too many people in one space. My daughter Simone, he who was 12 that year, sat on the floor near the tree with her cousin. My husband James was in the kitchen helping with dishes. My brother Danny was on the couch with his girlfriend. My sister Renee was moving around the room the way Renee always moved, animated and loud and taking up space the way she had since she was a child. My mother, Linda, sat in her chair near the tree. She had that particular expression she wore at family gatherings, the one that said she was happy, that things were as they should be. She started handing out gifts just after 8. I watched her go around the room. She handed Renee a wrapped box and said, "I saw this and thought of you immediately." She handed Danny an envelope and squeezed his arm. She had gifts for Renee's children, for Danny's girlfriend who none of us had met until that evening, I for James. She had a gift bag for her neighbor Patricia, who had dropped off a plate of Christmas cookies 2 days before. She had a gift card, already in an envelope with the name written on the front, for the mail carrier. The pile under the tree got smaller. I kept my hands in my lap. I was not counting. I was not waiting with expectation, at least not a conscious expectation. I had learned a long time ago not to expect too much from my mother when it came to things like this. But somewhere underneath the learned stillness, there was still a small place that hoped. When the last gift had been handed out, Renee looked around and laughed. "Mom, did you forget Carol?" My mother looked over at me. There was no panic on her face, no rush to the closet to find something she had set aside. She waved her hand, one easy motion, and said, "Carol understands. She doesn't need things like that." And then she turned back to watch Danny open his envelope. The room moved on. I heard someone say something funny, and people laughed. The music was still playing. Simone was tearing into wrapping paper. James appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, and caught my eye. His expression was careful. He had seen. I smiled at him. A small, controlled smile that said I was fine. I was not fine, but I was practiced at the appearance of fine. I sat with my paper plate and I listened to the room, and I thought about what my mother had said. Carol understands. She doesn't need things like that. Not a mistake. Not an oversight. A conclusion she had reached, stated out loud in front of everyone that I was the kind of person who did not need to be given to, and the kind of person who existed to give. Later that night, I sat in my car in her driveway before driving home. The engine was off. I had a gas station coffee in the cup holder that had gone cold an hour earlier. The windows were fogging slightly from the temperature difference between the cold night outside and the warmth still in my coat. I did not cry. I had moved past crying about this kind of thing years ago. I just sat in the quiet and let myself feel it clearly, without dressing it up as anything other than what it was. 14 days later, the text came. Carol, I need you. Something's happened. You're the only one I can call. I read it twice. Then I put the phone face down on the table and went to check on Simone. I already knew I would go. That was not the question. Section 2. Where this all began. To understand what that Christmas meant, you need to understand the house I grew up in and the family that shaped me. We lived in a suburb just outside Columbus. A small house, 2 bedrooms that we made work for 3 children, a yard with a chain-link fence, a neighborhood where most families were doing more or less the same thing we were, which was getting by. My mother, Linda, worked as a nursing assistant at a care facility 20 minutes from our house. She worked double shifts more often than not. She was tired most of the time, the deep physical tired that comes from years of being on your feet and caring for people who need more than you sometimes have left to give. My father left when I was 11. Danny was 8. Renee was 5. But I remember the morning after he left more clearly than the night he left. My mother sat at the kitchen table in her uniform, already dressed for a shift, and she looked at the 3 of us and said, "We are going to be okay." She said it the way you say something you need to believe, rather than something you already know. Then she finished her coffee and went to work. I was 11. I understood more than she knew. After my father left, something reorganized in our household. Not consciously, not deliberately, but the way things reorganize when a structure collapses and people find new positions out of necessity. Danny became the focus of a kind of careful attention. He was the only boy, the youngest son, and my mother turned toward him with a particular energy that felt like compensation, like she was determined that his father's absence would not define him. There were sports programs, tutoring sessions, extra effort directed his way in 100 small forms. Renee, the youngest, became my mother's companion. She was naturally expressive, naturally warm, the kind of child who climbed into your lap and said exactly what you needed to hear. She learned early how to sit with my mother when my mother was sad. She learned how to manage the mood of a room. My mother leaned on her in a different way, the way you lean on someone whose presence itself is comfort. And I became useful. It happened so gradually that I cannot point to a single moment when it started. I began cooking because someone needed to, and my mother was working. I babysat because childcare cost money we did not have. I ironed school uniforms on Sunday evenings because it was one less thing for my mother to carry. I learned to ask for very little because asking created friction, and friction made everything harder. And I had already decided, at 11 years old, that my job was to make things easier, not harder. I want to be clear about something. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was not abusive. She worked hard and she kept us housed and fed, and she did not walk away the way my father did. I am not telling this story to paint her as a monster, because she was not a monster. She was a tired, overwhelmed woman who leaned on the child who made herself most available to be leaned on, and she never stopped to ask whether that was fair. There is a difference between cruelty and neglect. Cruelty knows what it is doing. Neglect often does not. My mother never sat down and decided that Carol mattered less. She simply never sat down and decided that Carol mattered equally. And over years, that omission accumulated into something with real weight. I was 13 when I understood it most clearly, though I did not have language for it then. I had a small part in the school play. It was not a significant part, but I had worked on it, and I was proud of it, and the rehearsal ran late. I stood outside the school building afterward with my coat pulled tight, watching the other kids get picked up one by one until the parking lot was empty and the lights inside the school were being turned off. I waited for 90 minutes. When my mother's car finally pulled up, she was distracted. She did not get out. And I got into the passenger seat and she pulled away from the curb before I had my seatbelt fully clicked. "Danny had a game," she said. That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement that I had stood outside in the cold for an hour and a half. Just an explanation that something else had come first. I looked out the window and said nothing. I have thought about that night many times over the years. Not with anger, but with a kind of recognition. That was the clearest version of the pattern. Not dramatic, not even intentional. Just the ordinary, habitual practice of my needs coming after everyone else's, so consistently that it had stopped registering as a choice. Have you ever experienced something like that? A moment that was small enough to dismiss but too clear to forget? If this resonates with you, I think you already understand what I am describing. I got home that night, hung up my coat, and started on the dinner dishes. Section 3. What it looked like. Growing up. If that night in the parking lot was the first time I saw the pattern clearly, the years that followed gave me more examples than I ever wanted. When Danny finished high school, my mother took out a personal loan to help cover part of his college tuition. I remember hearing her talk about it with her sister on the phone. How important it was for Danny to have that foundation, how she would make the payments work. The loan was for $4,000. She paid it back over 2 years while working the same shifts she had always worked. When I finished high school a few years earlier, I had applied to the state university 40 minutes from our house. I had good grades. I was motivated. I went to my mother and told her I had gotten in and asked if there was any way she could help with tuition, even a small amount. She looked tired that evening. I remember she still had her work lanyard around her neck. "Carol," she said, "I think you should look into community college first. Get the basics done there and then transfer. It's more practical." She said it gently. She was not dismissing me to hurt me, but the contrast was there, even if neither of us named it out loud. A loan for Danny's tuition, a suggestion to scale down for mine. I did not argue. I enrolled in community college, worked 2 part-time jobs, and took night classes for 3 years before I had saved enough and transferred. I did it myself, without a dollar from my mother, and I finished my degree and built a life I am proud of. But I carried the knowledge of that comparison quietly for a long time. The pattern showed up again when I got married. James and I got married on a Thursday at the county courthouse. We were practical people, and a big wedding was not something we could afford or particularly wanted. We kept it small. My mother came. She left about 2 hours into the small gathering we had afterward, saying she had an early shift. She handed us an envelope as she was going. Inside was a card with a printed message and $40 in cash. I folded the card and put it in a drawer and went back to my guests. When Renee got married 3 years later, it was a different occasion entirely. My mother helped plan the wedding. She contributed money toward the venue deposit, and she spent weeks helping with decisions, phone calls, arrangements. On the day of the wedding, she sat in the front row and wept at the altar, the way mothers weep when something feels right and important. She gave a toast at the reception that made people laugh and then cry. I sat at my table and raised my glass. I was happy for Renee. I want to be clear about that. I did not begrudge my sister a beautiful wedding, but I noticed the difference. I had always noticed the difference. I had just trained myself to file it away. The one time I tried to say something about it, I chose my words carefully. We were at my mother's kitchen table on a regular Tuesday, drinking coffee. I said, calmly and without accusation, that I sometimes felt like things were not quite equal between me and my siblings. That I felt like certain things were made available to them that were not made available to me. My mother set down her mug. She looked at me, and her expression was not defensive exactly. It was genuinely confused, and then something that looked almost like pride. "Carol," she said, "you've always been so independent. I raised you to not need hand-holding. I thought that was a good thing." She meant it. That was what I could not get past. She was not deflecting out of guilt. She had genuinely rewritten the story inside her own mind. The neglect had become a compliment. She had told herself that Carol was strong because Carol had been given no other option, and she had never examined the space between those two things. I nodded. I said, "Okay, Mom." I drove home. I made dinner. And I stopped trying to explain to her what she was unable to see. Around that same time, I was at her house helping her sort through some boxes in the spare room. I found a birthday card she had sent Renee years before, still tucked inside a box of keepsakes Renee had left behind. I do not know why I opened it. I think I already knew what I would find. It was 2 pages, handwritten in my mother's careful print. She had written about specific memories, a road trip they had taken, a movie they had watched together. She had written about what Renee meant to her, the specific ways she was proud of her, what she hoped for her future. It ended with, "I love you more than I can put into words, but I keep trying." My birthday cards from my mother were always store-bought, signed with her name. I read it once. Then I folded it and put it back where I had found it. I closed the box. I went back to sorting. I stopped looking for evidence a long time ago. I already knew what I would find. Section 4. What I gave and what it cost. Knowing something and doing something about it are two very different things. I knew the pattern. I saw it clearly. But knowing did not stop me from continuing to show up. Because despite everything, they were my family and I loved them. And because somewhere underneath the layers of practical acceptance, I still believed that if I gave enough, if I was reliable enough, I would eventually be seen. Looking back now, I understand that belief for what it was. It was hope. And hope, when it has no foundation to stand on, becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you. Over the years that followed, I became the family's safety net. When my mother's car broke down, she called me. The repair estimate was $940. I did not have that sitting loose in my account. James and I had a mortgage, a daughter in school, our own expenses managed carefully on 2 ordinary incomes. But I moved things around and I paid the repair bill, and I told my mother to pay me back when she could. She never did. I eventually stopped expecting it. When Danny lost his job and could not make rent for 3 months, my mother called me. Her voice on the phone had that particular quality it got when she was about to cry, but was trying not to. The quality that had always made me move faster than I should. I sent Danny the money each month, through my mother, who handled the logistics. $380 a month for 3 months. $1,140 total. He did not call me to thank me. My mother thanked me on his behalf. I said it was fine. When Renee had her second baby and the nursery was not ready and money was tight, my mother mentioned it in a phone call. She did not ask directly. She described the situation in detail and then said, "I just hope they figure something out." The ask was inside the description, the way the asks in my family always were. Sideways, wrapped in context, left for me to locate and respond to. I bought the crib. $260, assembled and delivered. These are not the only examples. They are simply the ones I remember most clearly. Over roughly 9 years, I tracked what I had contributed to my family. Not obsessively, not with resentment, but I kept records the way a careful person keeps records. Man, because I am a careful person. The total came to a little over $22,000. I want you to understand what that number means in the context of our life. James and I were not wealthy. We were two working people managing a mortgage on a house in Columbus, raising a daughter, saving carefully for her education, maintaining a life that required planning. $22,000 was not a small amount. It was money we had budgeted around, money that sometimes meant choosing not to do something for ourselves so that I could do something for them. I told James every time. I was not hiding it from him. There was a night about 4 years in when we were sitting at the kitchen table going through our finances, the way we did on the first Sunday of every month. He asked how much the latest transfer to my mother had been. $450, I said. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He wrote the number in the ledger and was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at me with an expression I recognized, a mixture of love and restraint, the expression of a man who had decided the person he loved had the right to make her own choices even when he did not fully agree with them. "Okay," he said. That was all. I knew what his silence held. I knew he was watching me carry something he could not carry for me. And I knew, sitting at that table, that the cost of my loyalty to my family was not only mine to pay. It was spreading into the edges of the life James and I had built together. And it was being paid in small increments by a man who had never once demanded that I stop. The Christmas gift scene from the beginning of this story makes more sense now, doesn't it? $22,000 over 9 years. No repayment, no acknowledgement beyond the minimum. And then a Christmas where the neighbor who dropped off cookies got a gift bag with a bow on it, and I sat on the couch with a paper plate and a face that showed nothing. Section 5. The phone call that shifted everything. The text came 14 days after Christmas. "Carol, I need you. Something's happened. You're the only one I can call." I called her back within the hour. She had fallen in her bathroom, early in the morning, stepping out of the shower. Bruised ribs on her left side, sprained wrist. The urgent care clinic had wrapped the wrist and told her to rest and not lift anything heavy for at least 2 weeks. She was not hospitalized. She was home. But she was frightened, and she could not drive, and she could not cook without pain, and the idea of being alone in the house was making her anxious. I called Danny first. He was living in Atlanta with a new job and a new girlfriend he had introduced to the family over the summer. He answered quickly, and his voice was warm, and he sounded genuinely concerned when I told him about the fall. Then came the pause. "I really can't get back right now," he said. "The new job, it's just, the timing is terrible. Tell her I'll call her tonight." I called Renee. She has 2 small children and her husband travels for work several weeks a month. She listened to the whole situation and then said, "Carol, I physically cannot manage it right now. With the kids alone, I just can't add this. You know I would if I could." I knew. And I also knew that I was already reaching for my car keys. I drove 40 minutes to my mother's house on a Tuesday morning. I had called my supervisor and arranged to take 3 days of personal leave. I had brought a bag packed for 2 nights. I had stopped on the way to pick up groceries, because I had already done the quick mental inventory of what my mother was likely to have in her refrigerator, and what she was probably missing. For 3 days, I was there. I made her meals. I set up her medication schedule, the anti-inflammatory and the pain reliever, with the times written on a piece of paper and taped to the kitchen cabinet at eye level where she could see it easily. I drove her to her follow-up appointment with her doctor, sat in the waiting area, and drove her home. I cleaned her bathroom, the bathroom where she had fallen, and reorganized the items near the tub so there was less chance of it happening again. I changed her bedding because she had mentioned her back was aching and I thought it might help. I washed and folded 2 loads of laundry. I did not complain. I did not keep a running list of what I was doing or offer it to her as evidence of my effort. I just did it. Because that is what I have always done. On the second day, I was in the spare bedroom folding a basket of laundry. The door was partially open. My mother was in the living room, on her phone. Her voice was warm and relaxed, the easy voice she used with Renee, different from the slightly more formal register she sometimes had with me. I heard her laugh at something. Then I heard her say, "Carol's here, handling everything. You know how she is. She just does it." I stopped. I was holding one of her folded dish towels in both hands. I looked at the wall in front of me. I heard Renee say something through the phone that made my mother laugh again. "She just does it," said the way you would describe a setting on an appliance, the way you would explain a function, not a gift, not a sacrifice, not something that costs the person doing it anything at all, just a fact about how things worked. I stood in that spare room for a long time. Then I finished folding the laundry. I set the stack on the dresser in a neat pile. I sat down on the edge of the spare bed. The room was quiet. The window faced the backyard, and outside I could see the same fence, the same yard, the same tree in the corner that had been there my entire childhood. And I sat there and I felt something move inside me that I did not have an immediate name for. It was not anger exactly. It was more like a weight that had been resting on one side of a scale for a very long time, and suddenly the scale had tipped. I had been useful for so long that I had become invisible inside my own usefulness, and I had let it happen, not because I was weak, but because I loved my family and I had been hoping for 30 years that love would eventually be returned in kind. Sitting on that bed, I stopped hoping for that. I finished the laundry. I made dinner. I did not say a word that evening. I moved through the house quietly and competently, the way I always had. But something had ended. Section 6. The question I finally asked. On the evening of the second day after dinner, while we were sitting in the living room with the television on low, I turned to my mother and I asked her directly if she appreciated the help. She looked at me, slightly surprised by the question. "Of course I do, Carol. You know I do." I nodded. Then I asked the second question, the one I had been holding for 2 weeks. "Mom, why wasn't there a gift for me at Christmas?" The surprise on her face was genuine. She had not expected it, which told me she had not given it any real thought since it happened. There was a brief pause, and then a small expression that was not quite irritation, but was close to it. "I didn't think you cared about that kind of thing," she said. "You never said anything." I didn't say anything, I agreed, because I didn't want to make it awkward. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt." She shifted in her chair. Her wrapped wrist was in her lap. "Carol, you have James. You have a nice home. You have everything you need. I worry about the others more. You've always been the one who had it together." I heard every word of that. I heard what was in between the words, too. You need less, so you get less. Your stability is the reason I have overlooked you. I did not say that. I said, "Okay, Mom. Good night." I went to the spare room and I did not sleep for a long time. When I was sure she was asleep, I got up and I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table in the quiet. I opened the small notebook I keep in my bag for notes and errands and the practical details of daily life. And I began to write. Not an angry letter, not a list of accusations, just a record. A careful, honest account of what I had contributed to my family over the years: the car repair, Danny's rent money, 3 months, the exact amounts. The crib, The Christmas presents I had bought for nieces and nephews every year, the specific amounts, the birthday money I had sent, the time off work I had taken, the personal leave days I had used on situations like this one, the things I had done without being asked that had cost money I did not have freely to spend. The list took a long time. When I finished, I read it from top to bottom. Once. Quietly, in the kitchen of the house I grew up in, with the clock on the wall making its steady sound above the refrigerator. Then I made a decision. I was not going to disappear from this family. I was not going to stop loving them or being present for genuine emergencies. I was not going to become a different person out of bitterness, but I was going to stop making myself available at full capacity for people who had come to see my availability as a feature of the landscape, as just how things were, as something requiring no acknowledgement and no gratitude. And I was going to say it. Once. Clearly. Out loud. With witnesses. Not to punish anyone. Not to create a scene. But because I had spent 30 years being the most responsible person in this family while being consistently treated as the least significant one, and I had earned the right to say that out loud at least once before I spent another 30 years managing in silence. I closed the notebook. I washed my coffee cup. I went back to the spare room. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I drove my mother to her follow-up appointment, made sure her kitchen was stocked, and went home. Section 7. The person who stood beside me. James had known something was different the moment I walked through the door. He is not a man who presses. He does not fill silence with questions or offer opinions before they are wanted. He has been beside me for 11 years, and in that time he has learned that the way to be good to me is to be steady, to wait, and to ask the right question at the right moment. That evening, after Simone had gone to bed, he brought 2 cups of tea to the couch and sat down beside me. He did not say anything for a few minutes. He just sat with me the way you sit with someone when you know they are carrying something, and you want them to know they do not have to carry it alone. Eventually I told him. I told him about the laundry, about hearing my mother on the phone, about the words, "She just does it." I told him about the conversation afterward, the Christmas gift, my mother's explanation that I had everything I needed. I told him about the list I had written in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What do you need from me?" I had thought about that. I told him. In about a month, it was my mother's birthday. Danny was planning to come back from Atlanta for it. Renee would be there. My mother's sisters usually came. It would be the kind of full family gathering where everyone was present. I wanted to speak, not to cause a scene, not to humiliate anyone, but to say, clearly and in front of the people who had been present for all of it, what I had carried and what I needed to be acknowledged. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll help you figure out what to say." Over the next 3 evenings, after Simone had finished homework and gone to her room, James and I sat at the kitchen table. He pulled up our shared financial records on his laptop. He went through them with me, calmly, methodically, confirming specific dates and amounts that my memory had softened over time. He did not make it feel like he was building a legal case. He made it feel like he was helping me find solid ground to stand on so I could say something true without second-guessing myself. One evening, Simone wandered out for a glass of water and paused in the doorway, looking at us. "What are you working on?" she asked. "Homework," James said, which made me smile. Simone looked at me directly. She was 12, but she was perceptive in the way some children are, the ones who have been paying quiet attention since they were small. "Mom," she said, "does Grandma know how much you do for her?" The kitchen was quiet. I looked at my daughter for a moment, at her clear, serious face. "She's going to," I said. Simone looked at me for another second, the way she does when she is deciding whether something makes sense. Then she nodded, poured her water, and went back to her room. I looked at James. Something in my chest had settled. Okay, I said. Let's keep going. Section 8. The day I stood up. My mother's birthday fell on a Saturday that year. The house filled up the way it always did for these gatherings. Renee arrived early with her children and her husband. Danny flew in Friday night and was staying in the spare room. My mother's two sisters, Aunt Grace and Aunt Patricia, came from across town. Two neighbors who had been close to the family for years were invited. There were about 14 people in the house by the time everyone had arrived. It was warm and familiar. The kind of gathering I had participated in my whole life from a particular position: useful, present, reliable, and slightly outside the center of things. I had brought a dish. I had helped set up. I had greeted everyone warmly. James was beside me through all of it. We did not speak about what I was planning. There was nothing left to plan. I knew what I wanted to say. After dinner, there was the natural pause that happens at these gatherings, and the moment when the plates have been cleared and everyone is settling but before the cake comes out. The conversations were winding down. The room was relaxed. I stood up. I did not tap a glass. I did not clear my throat dramatically. I simply stood, and the people nearest to me noticed, and the conversation stopped. I want to say something, I said. It won't take long, and I want everyone to hear it. The room settled. I saw my mother look up from her chair. I saw Danny's expression shift from relaxed to cautious. Renee went still. I started with Christmas. 2 weeks ago, I said, I sat in this room and watched gifts be handed out to everyone here, to neighbors, to people I had never met before. There was nothing for me. When Renee noticed and said something, Mom said that Carol understands. She doesn't need things like that. I paused. Not for effect. Because I needed a breath. I want to be honest about something. That hurt. Not because of the gift itself, but because it confirmed something I have understood for a long time and never said out loud. That in this family I am most visible when I am useful, and least visible when I simply need to be included. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture. A few days after Christmas, Mom fell and needed help. Danny was in Atlanta. Renee couldn't manage it with the kids. I took 3 days off work and came here. I made meals, managed medications, took her to appointments, cleaned the bathroom, changed the bedding, did the laundry. On the second day, I heard Mom on the phone with Renee. She said, Carol's here, handling everything. You know how she is. She just does it. I looked around the room. I saw Aunt Grace's face. I saw one of the neighbors frown slightly. I saw Renee look at the table. I have a list, I said. I took the folded notebook paper from my pocket. I did not read all of it. I read 10 items. The car repair, $940. Danny's rent money, 3 separate months, total $1,140. The crib for Renee's second baby, $260. The personal leave days I had used for family situations over the years, approximately 14 working days. The birthday and Christmas contributions to nieces and nephews over 9 years. A few other items, specific, dated, factual. When I finished, the room was the quietest I had ever heard it. I am not asking to be paid back, I said. I want to be clear about that. I am asking for something simpler. I am asking to be seen, not just when something needs doing, all the time. I am asking to be thanked when I show up. I am asking to be considered when decisions are made in this family. I am asking to be included. I folded the paper. I put it back in my pocket. I love this family, I said. That is not in question. But love goes in more than one direction, and I have been moving in only one direction for a very long time. I sat down. The silence lasted for a full 10 seconds. I know because I counted. Then Aunt Grace, who was sitting 2 seats away from me, reached across and placed her hand over mine. She did not say anything. She just pressed her hand down, firm and warm, and kept it there. That was the moment my composure nearly broke. Not the speech, not the silence. That hand. I pressed my lips together and I breathed through my nose and I kept my face forward. My mother had not spoken. She was looking at the table in front of her. Danny was looking at the floor. Renee was looking at her hands. Then someone said quietly that it was time for the cake, and the room slowly, carefully came back to life. Section 9. What happened after? I will not tell you that everything changed immediately. That is not how families work. That is not how people work. The gathering ended without a confrontation. There were no arguments, no raised voices, no dramatic exits. People said goodbye and hugged and went to their cars. My mother kissed my cheek at the door. She did not say anything specific. She looked tired and a little shaken, but she kissed my cheek. James and I drove home mostly in silence. He held my hand on the gear shift for a portion of the drive. That was enough. 2 days later, Danny called. It was a longer call than usual. He asked about James. He asked about Simone, how she was doing in school, what she was interested in lately. He asked about my work. There was an awkwardness underneath the warmth of it, an awareness of something unfinished, but the call itself was a gesture. Danny is not a man built for direct apologies. I understood that. I accepted the gesture for what it was. Renee was harder. She sent a text the morning after the birthday gathering. It said, "You made Mom cry on her birthday." I don't think that was fair. I read the text. I put the phone down. I did not respond for 3 days. When I did respond, I wrote, "I have made myself invisible for 30 years so that no one would be uncomfortable. And I needed one moment to be honest. I hope you can understand that someday." Renee did not reply for a week. When she did, the message was 2 words. "I hear you." They were not an apology, but they were real. I knew Renee well enough to know that 2 words from her, after a week of silence, were the beginning of something. I received them accordingly. My mother called on a Tuesday evening about 10 days after the gathering. The conversation was careful. We talked around the edges for a few minutes before she said what she had called to say. Her voice was slower than usual, quieter. "I didn't know you kept track of everything," she said. "I wasn't keeping score," I told her. "I was keeping records. There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment. "I should have gotten you a gift," she said finally. "At Christmas. I should have gotten you a gift. It was small. It was late. It did not undo years of omission. But I had not been expecting a transformation. I had been expecting, at minimum, to be seen. And in that sentence, stated plainly and without deflection, I was. "Thank you for saying that, Mom," I said. We talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things. Then we said goodnight. I sat in the kitchen after I hung up, in the quiet, and I thought about what had actually changed. The family had not been remade. My mother had not become a different person. Renee was still processing. Danny's acknowledgement had been sideways and incomplete. But I had changed. I had said the thing out loud that I had been carrying for 30 years, and I had said it clearly and calmly and with my full name attached to it. I had stopped performing invisibility, and I had taken up space in my own family in a way I never had before. That part could not be undone, not by them and not by me. And somehow, that was the part that mattered most. Section 10. The life I am building now. It has been several months since the birthday gathering. I still call my mother. We talk most weeks. The conversations are different now, slightly more careful on both sides, but also more honest in small ways that I notice and appreciate. She asked me recently how work was going, what Simone was up to, whether James and I had any plans for the spring. These are not extraordinary questions, but she asked them first, without waiting for me to fill the space. I still show up for genuine emergencies. I am not someone who withdraws love to prove a point, but I no longer volunteer before being asked. Can I no longer send money without a direct conversation about what is being requested and what the expectations are? I no longer accept the unspoken arrangement where my availability is assumed and my needs are invisible. That shift alone has changed something in how I move through my life. I also started seeing a therapist. I want to say that clearly because I think there is still a tendency, particularly among people raised the way I was, to see that as an admission of weakness. It is not. I went because I had spent most of my life believing that needing nothing was the same as being strong, and I needed someone to help me examine that belief and take it apart carefully. What I have learned, slowly, in those sessions is this: strength is not the absence of need. Strength is being honest about what you need and building a life where those needs have a legitimate place. I had been performing self-sufficiency for so long that I had genuinely lost track of where the performance ended and I began. That work is not finished. It is not the kind of work that finishes, but it is the most important work I have done in a long time. If this resonates with you, I hope you will consider whether there is something similar you have been carrying. Not just in families, but in any relationship where your reliability has become invisible to the people who depend on it. Tell me in the comments if you have. I think more people understand this than are willing to say so. The following Christmas, James and I hosted at our house for the first time. My mother came. Renee came with her family. Danny could not make it, but he called in the morning and stayed on the phone long enough that it felt real. Simone helped me decorate. She has strong opinions about tinsel, which I respect. The house smelled like the pine wreath we hung on the front door, and the roast in the oven, and the particular warmth of a home that is being lived in with intention. A few days before Christmas, I bought myself a gift, something small that I had wanted for a long time and had kept not buying because there was always something more practical to spend the money on. I wrapped it in the same paper I used for everything else. I wrote my name on the tag in my own handwriting. I put it under the tree. When James saw it that evening, he raised an eyebrow. I shrugged and smiled. On Christmas morning, I opened it first. It was a small thing, but it was mine, chosen by me, for me, placed under a tree in a house where I was not optional, but central. And that simple act of including myself, of not waiting to be remembered, of not measuring my worth by whether someone else thought to acknowledge it, felt like the truest gift I had given in a long time. I have thought a lot about what I want to say to close this story. I do not want to give you a list of instructions or a set of lessons wrapped up neatly. Life does not work that way, and I think you are smart enough to know that. What I will say is this: the people who show up for you most reliably are not always the ones who were supposed to. Sometimes it is a husband who writes numbers in a ledger without complaint and holds your hand on the drive home after the hardest evening of your adult life. Sometimes it is a 12-year-old daughter who asks a simple question with her whole heart and then goes back to her room and lets you figure out the answer yourself. Sometimes it is an aunt's hand over yours in a quiet room. Asking to be seen is not the same as demanding to be worshipped. It is the minimum. It is the baseline of what one person owes another in a relationship built on genuine love. If you have been accepting less than that for a long time, I want to say clearly, you are allowed to name it. You are allowed to ask for it. You are allowed to change the terms. The moment you stop performing invisibility, you discover how much space you were always allowed to take up. I stopped waiting to be included. I started including myself. That was the only gift I needed to give.